A racist, corrupt cop kicked a black woman in a public park without knowing who she was, and what happened next shocked an entire city. It started on a quiet Tuesday morning, the sun just starting to burn off the fog that hovered above the dew-soaked grass. She was there early, like always, long before the soccer moms and their strollers arrived, before the local runners traced their familiar routes. Alone in the open field, barefoot and centered, she moved through a precise sequence of martial arts forms, disciplined, controlled, each movement honed by years of relentless training. It was her ritual. Her peace. Until he showed up. The squad car pulled up fast, gravel crunching under tires, even though there was no emergency, no threat. He didn't see a peaceful woman training. He didn't care to understand. All he saw was a black woman moving with purpose in a white neighborhood park. His first words were not a greeting or an inquiry. They were an accusation. "What the hell do you think you're doing out here? You don't belong here." She looked up, surprised, but calm. She tried to explain, that she was just training, that she came every morning, that this was public space. But he didn't want answers. He wanted submission. His voice grew louder, his stance more aggressive. People were starting to watch. Joggers slowed. A couple across the field stopped mid-stride. One of them started recording. "I said get on the ground, now. Hands behind your back." "For what?" "I haven't done anything," she replied, still trying to reason, still trying to believe that logic and composure could fix what centuries of hate had built. But he didn't want reason. He wanted power. And then, with no hesitation, he kicked her in the chest. The blow knocked the air from her lungs and dropped her to the ground. The crowd gasped. A child cried in the distance. And that was the moment he lost control of the narrative, because she got back up. Not with rage. Not with panic. But with the calm precision of someone who had been taught that violence could be met with skill, not chaos. She didn't strike first. She waited. And when he lunged again, she moved, one defensive maneuver, one turn, one technique, and suddenly, the cop was the one on the ground, face down, disarmed, humiliated in front of everyone. The video hit the internet before the squad car even cleared the parking lot. At first, it was just another clip. Another case of a black citizen brutalized by a white cop. But this time, it didn't end with silence or hashtags. Because someone recognized her. And then someone else did. And then the truth began to unravel. She wasn't just a woman practicing martial arts in the park. She was a master. A community leader. A mentor. A former consultant for police training programs that had been defunded when people like him pushed them aside, claiming they weren't necessary. She had submitted reports. Warnings. She had filed complaints about officers using excessive force, about racial profiling. One of those complaints had been about him. But every time, her voice was dismissed. Every document she filed was buried. Until now. Now, every suppressed report with his name on it resurfaced. Every community complaint that was once ignored exploded back into the public eye. Old videos were unearthed. Testimonies from people too afraid to speak back then were finally heard. Patterns emerged. A system of abuse was uncovered. And at the center of it all, him. Suddenly, the man who used to bark orders without consequence was sitting across from internal investigators, squirming in courtrooms, and reading headlines that painted him not as a hero, but as a monster. His badge, once a symbol of power, became the very thing that condemned him. He tried to claim she assaulted him. He tried to sue. But the footage showed the truth. The world had already seen what happened. And no amount of spin could erase that image, of a man in uniform, drunk on authority, being calmly dismantled by the woman he thought he could silence. But the most haunting part wasn't the takedown. It wasn't the headlines. It wasn't the court hearings or the protests or even the apology he was forced to make on national television. It was what came after. What she chose to do with the spotlight. She didn't just walk away victorious. She built something. A movement. A program. A space for others who had been beaten down, overlooked, disrespected, to rise. And in doing so, she didn't just bring justice to herself. She gave it to everyone who had ever been told they were too loud, too aggressive, too much. The same park where she was humiliated became a training ground for young black girls learning to stand their ground. The same department that ignored her warnings had to publicly acknowledge her contributions to reform. And the same officer who once used his authority to hurt others had to face a reality where she held the power to shape what came next. But the question that no one could quite answer, the question that kept surfacing in interviews, in news segments, in whispered conversations around the city, was this: why was he so afraid of her? Was it her strength? Her confidence? The fact that she didn't back down? Or was it something deeper, something he knew long before that kick ever landed? Because buried under his rage, his fear, and his uniform, was a secret. And when that secret finally comes to light, you'll understand why this story isn't just about justice. It's about reckoning. And you won't believe what he was hiding all along. Before we begin today's story, we want to speak directly to our black viewers. We see you. We hear you. We stand with you. At Plow of Twist, we do not tolerate racism, discrimination, or any form of injustice. Our stories aim to reflect truth, inspire change, and uplift those whose voices have been silenced for too long. You're not alone, and your story matters. Now, get ready for a powerful ride. Enjoy the story, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. The morning air in Richmond, Virginia still carried the cool trace of dawn when Amara Bennett laced up her shoes and stepped outside. Her neighborhood was quiet, still half asleep, the sidewalks damp with dew and the trees casting long, slanted shadows over the yards. The sun hadn't yet burned through the thin fog that wrapped around the streets like a shroud. She preferred this time of day, when the world was slow, thoughtful, and her breath was the only sound filling the empty streets. At 38, Amara was not the kind of woman people expected. She wasn't loud. She wasn't aggressive. She was calm, deeply composed, with a posture that radiated both strength and stillness. Her presence commanded respect before a word was spoken, but not because she demanded it, because she embodied it. Born and raised in the south side of Chicago before moving to Virginia in her early 20s, Amara had long outgrown the narrative that society tried to script for black women like her. She had seen enough systems fail to understand that survival required more than just strength, it required discipline, intellect, and purpose. After earning her master's degree in education and a second degree in physical therapy, Amara could have lived a life behind desks or conference rooms. But she chose a different path, one that started in a small community center where she volunteered to teach self-defense to women who were tired of being afraid. What began as a side project grew into a structured program of empowerment, physical strength, and emotional resilience. Her reputation expanded quickly. She wasn't just a martial artist, she was a mentor, a voice in city council meetings, a consultant for youth programs, and someone many young black girls called a second mother. But what made Amara different wasn't just her titles or credentials. It was how she carried the weight of the world without bitterness. How she walked into predominantly white institutions with her head held high, even when she knew she wasn't truly welcome. How she corrected the subtle racism in board meetings with calm precision. How she stood her ground, always. She didn't need to raise her voice. She only needed to speak for people to listen. Every morning, Amara trained in Bird Park, a sprawling green space that wrapped around the lake and stretched into quiet corners where she could practice her katas in peace. The park was mostly empty at dawn, just a few joggers, early dog walkers, and the occasional city maintenance worker preparing the space for the day. It was her sanctuary. Her breath moved in rhythm with her body. Her movements were fluid and deliberate, flowing like water through ancient patterns that had been passed down through centuries of warriors. She wore her black GI without insignia, but those who watched closely could tell, her form, her balance, her discipline, this woman had mastered something far beyond recreational skill. Amara had always believed that preparation was a form of prayer. That mastering your body gave you the language to defend not just yourself, but your dignity. She had taught countless women how to navigate fear, how to make their bodies allies instead of cages. She had trained daughters who had been assaulted, mothers who had lost sons to street violence, elders who feared the dark. Her work wasn't just about kicking and punching, it was about healing. About reclaiming space in a world that tried to shrink you. But not everyone saw it that way. Officer Darren Whitaker had been on the Richmond police force for over 15 years. In the department, he was known for being old school, which, in practice, meant abrasive, controlling, and disturbingly comfortable with racial profiling. He'd grown up in a working-class suburb of Roanoke and joined the force straight out of high school, skipping college, drawn by the power a uniform seemed to give. Over the years, he built a reputation for being a man who got things done. What people whispered, but rarely said aloud, was that he also had a habit of targeting young black men during traffic stops, using force unnecessarily during arrests, and ignoring protocol when it suited his version of justice. Internal Affairs had investigated him twice, but nothing ever stuck. He was protected. Respected by his buddies on the force. Feared in the neighborhoods he patrolled. He believed in the myth of himself, that he was the last line of order in a world slipping into chaos. That the badge made him untouchable. His disdain for activists, especially black women who spoke boldly in public forums, was no secret. He called them troublemakers, rolled his eyes in meetings when their names came up. He viewed community organizers as soft. He laughed at city trainings on implicit bias. To him, the world was black and white, and the badge always came first. Authority meant dominance. And when dominance was challenged, even by silence, he saw it as a threat. The morning their lives collided, Amara was mid-sequence, flowing through a set of defensive motions when Whitaker's patrol car rolled up to the edge of the field. He wasn't dispatched there. He was off route, irritated after a confrontation earlier in the morning and looking for something to exert control over. He parked the car carelessly on the grass and stepped out with the same heavy boots that had kicked in doors and shoved protesters. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to understand. In his eyes, there was no reason a black woman should be moving like that, alone, focused, confident, in a neighborhood park. It didn't matter that she wasn't doing anything illegal. To him, she was out of place. Suspicious. Disrespectful. He barked at her to stop. Demanded identification. When she asked why, he smirked and took a step closer. The few joggers nearby slowed down. One of them pulled out their phone. But Amara didn't flinch. She responded clearly, firmly, explaining she had a right to be there. That she wasn't breaking any law. That she trained there every morning. His face changed. The smirk tightened. His jaw clenched. "Oh, so now you people know the law better than me," he said. Amara stood still. No aggression in her voice. No fear in her eyes. "I know my rights." That was all it took. The moment snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. The officer's hand moved fast, not to draw his weapon, but to assert dominance. He shoved her shoulder. Then, when she didn't stumble, when she stood her ground, he kicked. Hard. And the world changed. In the aftermath, the news would focus on the takedown. On the way she defended herself with elegance and control, disarming him without ever throwing a single aggressive strike. On how she walked away while he lay in the dirt, stunned and gasping. But that moment was not where her story began, and it certainly wasn't where it would end. Because the truth is, this confrontation didn't come out of nowhere. It was built slowly, over decades. Through the accumulation of silence, overlooked complaints, buried reports, and invisible bruises. Through a system that rewarded men like Whitaker for intimidation while ignoring the voices of women like Amara who tried to warn them. This wasn't just a random act of police brutality. This was a collision between two lives built on opposite principles, one on fear and control, the other on strength and balance. And beneath all of it, something deeper had been set in motion. Because that morning wasn't the first time their paths had crossed. It was just the first time the world was watching. And the question now was, when the dust settled, and the full truth came to light, who would the city believe? The man with the badge? Or the woman who refused to stay silent? And what was it, hidden in his past, that made him react with such violent fear at the sight of her calm? You'll want to stay with this story until the end. Because what she discovers next will change everything. The silence that followed the incident at the park didn't last long. Within hours, the video began circulating through local community group chats, then onto Facebook, then Twitter, then the local news. The clip wasn't shaky or unclear, it was crisp, framed almost too perfectly, showing every moment from the officer's aggressive approach to the clean, controlled way Amara defended herself. The image of her standing over him, not triumphant but grounded, refusing to escalate the violence, burned itself into the city's collective memory. For some, it was the first time they had ever seen a black woman push back in public and not crumble under the consequences. For others, it was a direct challenge to everything they believed about authority, power, and place. But for Amara, it wasn't a victory. It was a storm, and it was just beginning. By the time she arrived home that morning, her phone had already begun to explode. Missed calls from news outlets, reporters, local activists. Texts from former students, colleagues, and city officials. Her inbox filled with a tidal wave of messages, some encouraging, others threatening. A voicemail from her sister in Chicago begged her not to go out alone. Another from a city councilwoman offered a lawyer's number. And then there were the ones from the police department. Formal. Cold. A request for a statement. A warning that ongoing investigation protocols would be followed. The kind of language that felt like a fuse being lit under her feet. Her mind was calm, but her body trembled. Not from fear, but from the weight of it all. The weight of knowing this moment was bigger than her. That she was now a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. And symbols, she knew, were often easier to destroy than human beings. Still, she refused to disappear. She walked into her studio that afternoon and taught her regular self-defense class. She stood in front of 20 women of all ages, all colors, all levels of experience, and she said only one thing before beginning: they will try to control the story. Don't let them. The students nodded. Not all understood the depth of her words yet, but they felt the truth in them. Meanwhile, the department scrambled. Officer Darren Whitaker was placed on administrative leave, a term the public had come to recognize as Code 4, we hope this goes away soon. But the pressure didn't ease. Journalists dug into his record. Activists demanded answers. At first, the department tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a routine check gone wrong, but the video spoke louder than any press release. Protests gathered outside the precinct. A mural of Amara appeared overnight on a brick wall downtown, her silhouette standing tall, painted in defiant tones of gold and black. The city was changing, and it was happening faster than anyone anticipated. Still, there was a cold, calculated resistance forming behind the scenes. Inside the department, meetings were held in hushed tones. Union representatives spoke of overreach and media hysteria. Some officers voiced support for Whitaker, others remained silent. But silence, Amara knew, was never neutral. It was a choice. And she could feel the weight of it pressing against her like a fog she couldn't see through. The tension in the city was no longer just about one incident, it was about everything that had led to it. Years of abuse swept under bureaucratic rugs. Warnings ignored. Reports sealed away. But someone had to open them. Someone had to remember. At the community center, Amara sat down with Jordan, a young lawyer who had once been one of her students. He brought a folder thick with paperwork, timelines, and documentation she barely remembered filling out. "This is everything you submitted to the department, going back 6 years," he said quietly, laying it all out on the table. "Complaints about inappropriate behavior, racial profiling, excessive force, and this one," he paused, tapping a form near the bottom of the stack, "this one names Whitaker directly." Amara exhaled slowly, the memory surfacing like a bruise. She had filed it after a teenage boy she mentored was arrested outside the rec center for resisting, even though there were 3 witnesses who said he never moved. She remembered the boy's face, the fear in his eyes, the quiet way he stopped coming to class after that. "It went nowhere," she said flatly. Jordan nodded. "It was marked unsubstantiated and filed without follow-up." She felt a slow burn in her chest, not anger exactly, but something older, exhaustion maybe, or disappointment that once again, proof alone wasn't enough. She stood up and walked to the window, watching kids play across the street. They didn't know yet how the world would test them, how some would learn early to move differently, speak softer, avoid sudden movements. But she knew. She'd lived it. "What are we going to do with this?" she asked without turning. Jordan's voice was quiet but steady. "We're going to use it. We're going to make it public. But I need you to be ready." She turned to face him, eyes sharp. "I've been ready my whole life." Across town, Whitaker was living a different kind of storm. The walls of loyalty he once relied on were beginning to crack. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued man named Carson Reynolds, paced in his office like a caged animal, barking into phones, demanding statements be retracted, videos removed. But the internet had no delete button. Once the story caught wind, it spread like wildfire, and people who had long felt powerless were now emboldened. Testimonies began surfacing, former students, ex-officers, even anonymous tipsters. Some were vague. Others were devastating. In a meeting with Internal Affairs, Whitaker's composure was slipping. He spoke too loudly, interrupted questions, contradicted himself. When asked if he remembered ever interacting with Amara before the park incident, he hesitated for a moment too long. "I've seen her around," he said finally, "she gives lectures or something." But that wasn't the truth. He had seen her more than that. Spoken to her. In settings where she had stood in front of men like him and taught restraint, discipline, empathy. And he'd hated every minute of it. Back at her studio, Amara continued her life in fragments, teaching, preparing, speaking with her lawyer, attending forums. But every night, the pressure grew. There were letters slipped under her door. Threats in comment sections. A man followed her car for 3 blocks one evening before speeding off. She logged everything. Reported everything. She stayed vigilant. Then came the invitation. A public hearing was to be held by the Richmond City Council on police accountability and community relations. Amara was requested to speak. Not just requested, highlighted. She would sit on the panel as the community representative. The announcement alone drew headlines. Whitaker's name would not be discussed officially, but everyone knew why the hearing was happening. The night before the hearing, Amara couldn't sleep. She sat alone in her studio, lights dimmed, the silence humming like a heartbeat in her ears. She remembered the first time she taught a self-defense class. How nervous she was. How she doubted if anyone would listen to a woman like her talk about power. And now, the city would listen. The world, maybe. But not because she wanted attention. Because she had been pushed too far to stay silent. As the city braced for what came next, whispers swirled in every corner, rumors, speculation, a hunger for justice mixed with the bitter taste of fear. But something far more dangerous was about to emerge. Something hidden. Something buried in files and reports and sealed archives. Something about Whitaker. Something even Amara didn't know yet. And when it finally surfaced, it wouldn't just shake the city. It would burn everything they thought they knew to the ground. The day of the hearing arrived with a heavy, electric silence. Outside the city hall, people gathered in clusters, some holding signs, others just watching, waiting, unsure of what to expect but sensing that something irreversible was about to unfold. The marble steps, once just part of the city's architecture, now felt symbolic, cold, looming, and heavy with history. Inside, the air was tight with anticipation. The panel was already seated, and Amara sat at the end of the table, shoulders square, hands resting calmly on her lap. She wore no makeup, no colors, just black, tailored and stark, as if her very presence was a statement. She didn't speak when they called the meeting to order. She waited. Observing. To her left sat Councilwoman Torres, an older Latina with silver streaks in her bun and eyes that had seen too much. Beside her, community members, legal experts, youth representatives. And then, in the front row of the chamber, flanked by two uniformed officers who had been instructed not to react, sat Darren Whitaker. His expression was different now. Gone was the cocky tilt of the chin, the careless slouch of arrogance. His jaw was tight, eyes restless. He looked like a man who had been unraveling in silence, thread by thread, trying to hold the seams of his life together in public view. His lawyer wasn't beside him. Carson had pulled out of the case days earlier, after something came to light. Something even he didn't want to be connected to. Darren sat alone. Councilwoman Torres cleared her throat and leaned toward the mic, her voice calm but commanding as she introduced the session and outlined the purpose: public transparency, departmental reform, and community healing. It sounded noble, procedural. But the air said otherwise. People didn't come for procedure. They came for truth. When Amara's name was called to speak, a hush fell over the room so complete it felt like the walls themselves were listening. She rose slowly, walked to the podium, and for a moment, didn't speak. She scanned the room, her eyes pausing on faces she recognized, others she didn't. But when they landed on Darren, something subtle shifted in her stance. Not fear. Not anger. Just resolve. She began not with the park incident, but with a name. Malik Harmon. A 17-year-old boy arrested 3 years ago outside her community center. His charges had been dropped. But the emotional damage had stayed. She spoke of him softly, without embellishment, describing the quiet way he stopped trusting adults, stopped speaking up in class. She mentioned another name. Then another. Names that had been forgotten or buried in reports no one read. She didn't have to accuse Darren directly. She simply laid out the connections. The timeline. The pattern. Each one leading closer to him without ever needing to say it. But then she paused. There is something that's been kept from this city, she said, her voice steady. Something I only learned 2 nights ago. The silence tightened. It was brought to my attention through anonymous documentation, sealed reports, never investigated. Reports not just about misconduct, but about abuse. Internal abuse. Within the department. A ripple moved through the audience. Murmurs. Frowns. Darren's eyes narrowed. He shifted uncomfortably, as if trying to brace for something he didn't quite understand yet. I have in my possession a file, she continued, that names Officer Darren Whitaker as the subject of 3 internal complaints, not by civilians, but by fellow officers. Officers who claimed he manipulated reports, doctored evidence, and, she stopped, locking eyes with him, threatened them into silence. Gasps. Councilwoman Torres turned her head sharply. Papers shuffled. The city clerk froze mid-scribble. And Darren, for the first time, looked completely exposed. He opened his mouth slightly, but no words came. Amara stepped back from the mic. Torres leaned forward again, her voice barely above a whisper but picked up clearly by the mic. Ms. Bennett, are these documents in your possession now? Yes, Amara replied. And they've been submitted to an independent investigative body, outside this city's jurisdiction. Darren stood suddenly, and for a split second, the room flinched. But he didn't move toward her. He turned to Torres. "This is a witch hunt," he muttered, voice thick. "She's making this personal." "You made it personal," Amara replied before anyone else could speak. "When you used your badge not to serve the people, but to protect yourself. When you buried the voices of your own colleagues. When you lied. You don't know what the hell you're talking about," Darren snapped, voice rising, hands clenched. "You think you're better than us because you've got a mic and a platform? You think this city gives a damn about you?" Amara didn't blink. "No. But they care about the truth. And you've been hiding from it long enough." Torres struck her gavel once. "That's enough." But the words had already been spoken. And the crowd had heard. Later that afternoon, the documents were published. Redacted names, but clear enough. Dates. Incidents. A signed affidavit from a former officer who had since left the force after allegedly being threatened by Darren during an internal investigation. The details were damning. A manipulation of dash-cam footage. Intimidation of witnesses. Retaliation against a junior officer who had tried to file an official complaint. Everything Amara had suspected but hadn't dared say aloud was now public. That evening, Whitaker's house was swarmed by reporters. His suspension was upgraded to termination pending criminal investigation. But the most painful blow came not from the media, not from the city council, but from within. His own daughter, a freshman in college, posted a video saying she stood with Amara. That she had been ashamed of what her father had become. That silence was no longer an option. Darren watched the video alone in his apartment, curtains drawn, the light from the TV washing his face in pale blue. His hands trembled, not from rage this time, but from the realization that everything he had built was collapsing. And the person who had brought it down hadn't raised a fist. She had simply told the truth. Back at the studio, Amara sat with Jordan and a few close friends. They didn't celebrate. Not yet. There was still pain. Still work. But there was also a quiet power in the air. The sense that a threshold had been crossed. She leaned back, watching the news scroll silently across the screen. "We're not done," she said softly. Jordan looked over. Not even close. And in the distance, in rooms not yet opened, more truths waited. Because the file Amara had received wasn't the only one. And the person who sent it remained anonymous. For now. The night after the hearing, the city buzzed with a strange mix of electricity and silence. Outside Amara's studio, candles had been placed along the sidewalk, some in vigil, others in gratitude. People came and went quietly, as if entering sacred space. Inside, Amara sat on the floor of the training mat, her knees tucked beneath her, staring at the anonymous envelope that had arrived earlier that day. No return address. Just her name, handwritten in thick blue ink. Jordan had opened it first, reading through the pages with a look that shifted slowly from confusion to dread. Now, he stood by the window, arms folded, watching her. She hadn't said a word since reading the last page. "It's more than we thought," he finally whispered. Amara's voice was low, hollow. He wasn't just silencing officers, he was part of the committee that filtered internal reports. He didn't just manipulate files, he buried them. Assigned to oversight and used it to erase the people who challenged him. Jordan nodded slowly, rubbing his jaw. And it wasn't just Darren. The documents mentioned two other names, commanders still active. One of them helped shut down the early community police partnership program. That wasn't budget cuts. It was sabotage. Amara looked down at the floor. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something far deeper, betrayal. That program was saving lives. And they killed it. Not because it didn't work. But because it gave us too much voice. Jordan sat beside her, knees cracking as he settled. You have a decision to make. If this goes public, it's not just Whitaker anymore. This exposes the department's highest ranks. This tears it all down. You're not just their target now, you're the fuse." She stared ahead, eyes unfocused. Her breath slow and deep. Then let it burn. Later that night, she found herself alone in the quiet of her apartment, standing by the window, staring out at the lights blinking across the city. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered instinctively. A man's voice came through, low, calm, almost regretful. "I sent the file. I can't stay involved, but I couldn't carry it anymore. Not after what they did to you. Not after what I saw them do to that boy in 19. You don't need my name. Just know, you're not alone." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stood there for a long time, phone still in her hand, heart pounding in a strange, steady rhythm. Something was shifting. Something irreversible. The next day, Darren appeared unannounced at the community center. No cameras. No crowd. Just him, in jeans and a hoodie, standing outside the entrance like he didn't quite know what he was doing there. Amara saw him through the window, paused mid-sentence during a mentoring session, and excused herself. When she stepped outside, the air between them was instantly heavy. He spoke first. "I need to talk." "Just us." Amara didn't answer. She crossed her arms, her stance guarded but not afraid. He looked smaller now. Not physically, but somehow diminished. His voice cracked slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Hell, I wouldn't if I were you. But I need to say some things before it all comes crashing down." She tilted her head. "Why now?" He sighed, eyes on the ground. "Because I was raised to believe the badge meant everything. That it made you right, even when you weren't. That if you wore the uniform, your flaws didn't count. I leaned into that. I used it. And when you started speaking out, it scared the hell out of me. Not because you were wrong, but because you weren't." Her jaw clenched, voice quiet but sharp. "You tried to destroy me. You didn't just attack me in a park. You tried to erase everything I stood for. And now that you've lost control of the narrative, you want redemption." He looked up, eyes raw. "No. I want to take responsibility." There was silence. Thick. Charged. "You silenced Malik. You humiliated mothers. You planted fear in people's lives that never left them. What am I supposed to do with that?" He didn't answer right away. His voice cracked again when he finally did. "Tell the truth. That I failed. That I let hate win. That power turned me into something I don't even recognize." Amara's eyes didn't soften. But her voice did, just barely. "You want redemption, Darren? Then don't come here empty-handed. Go public. Confess. Testify. Expose every last one of them. Until then, you're just a man running from his own reflection." He nodded slowly, absorbing the blow. "I will. I swear. I'll do it all." She didn't say goodbye. She turned and walked back inside. But something about his face stayed with her, not because she felt sorry for him, but because she saw something deeper. The beginning of consequence. The start of a reckoning he could no longer outrun. The following week, the second set of documents were published, this time not by a journalist or activist, but by the Richmond Tribune, citing official records obtained through a whistleblower inside the department. The report detailed systematic suppression of internal misconduct complaints, going back over a decade. Darren's name appeared alongside two former captains, both now under investigation. But what shocked the city most wasn't the names, it was the patterns. Names of victims long forgotten. Testimonies dismissed as exaggeration. Entire neighborhoods treated like enemy territory. Community meetings erupted. Civilian review boards were reinstated overnight. The mayor, previously silent, issued a public apology and announced sweeping reforms. But Amara didn't celebrate. Not yet. She stood at a podium in front of the city courthouse, days later, addressing a sea of faces. She wore white this time. Not as a symbol of peace, but of clarity. We are not asking for favors. We are not asking for charity. We are demanding the justice that should have been ours all along. And no, this isn't the end. This is the beginning. Among the crowd, Darren stood, silent, head bowed. The cameras caught him. The city saw him. Not as a villain. Not as a hero. But as a man caught in the light of his own undoing. Later that evening, he walked into a press conference and did what Amara had asked. He named names. Detailed the procedures. Took questions without a lawyer present. His voice didn't shake. It didn't seek pity. It delivered weight. And the final blow came when he looked into the lens and said, I spent years silencing the truth. If you're watching this, and I harmed you, I won't ask forgiveness. But I'm not hiding anymore. I hope you speak louder than I ever did, and Amara, watching from her studio, whispered under her breath, they will, because they already were. The ripple had turned into a wave. The movement into a revolution. And in that moment, the city held its breath, knowing something irreversible had begun. The storm that followed Darren's public confession wasn't the violent kind that rips through cities in one night and disappears by morning. It was slower, heavier, the kind that seeps into every institution and leaves no corner untouched. In the days that followed his broadcast, Richmond found itself at a crossroads it could no longer ignore. Not because the truth hadn't been whispered before, but because it was now carved into the public record, undeniable, irreversible. The weight of those years, of every silenced complaint and every manipulated report, hung in the air like thick humidity. And at the center of that weight stood Amara, not as a figure of revenge, but as the symbol of everything they had tried so hard not to see. She didn't appear in the media for several days after the press conference. There were calls, offers for interviews, requests from national outlets, and even a petition for her to run for office. But she declined them all. Not out of fear or fatigue, but because she understood something that few others did. The noise was not the solution. The real work was quieter, messier, and happened away from flashing lights. So instead of giving speeches, she sat with young girls in classrooms who had questions they didn't know how to ask. She met with survivors of police intimidation who had buried their stories so deep they'd forgotten the sound of their own voices. She returned to the community center every day, not because it was safe, but because it was real. But even in her silence, the city buzzed with her presence. Muralists repainted her figure on new walls. Children wrote essays in school about strength and truth. Old neighbors sent letters saying they wished they had stood up sooner. And still, through it all, Amara remained grounded. Because she had seen these waves before, surges of outrage that faded when the next headline took over. And she refused to be another moment lost in time. Meanwhile, Darren's world was collapsing piece by piece. After his confession, the department launched a full-scale audit. Officers were suspended. Files were reopened. 2 commanders were removed from duty pending criminal charges. Community leaders were brought into advisory boards that had been symbolic for years. And then came the federal inquiry. No one expected it to move quickly, but the very fact that it had been triggered was a signal that Richmond was no longer operating in the shadows. Darren gave 3 more statements over the course of a month. Each one more detailed. Each one costing him more. Friends stopped returning his calls. His pension was frozen. He was forced to move out of his home after threats were made. But he kept talking. Not to gain sympathy, but as if purging a lifetime of secrets that had hollowed him out from the inside. One evening, Amara sat with Jordan in the back office of the community center, reviewing a draft of the new civilian oversight proposal. It was a delicate moment. People wanted justice, but also clarity. They wanted accountability without collapsing the institution entirely. Jordan tapped his pen against the table. "What happens if they ask you to lead it?" he said carefully. Amara didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted to the window, where a group of teenagers laughed loudly by the basketball court. The sunset bathed the room in gold, but the weight of his question lingered in the shadows. "It's not about me," she finally said. "It never was. If I take that position, they'll say it's personal. That I'm biased. That I'm on a crusade. But if I step away completely, we risk losing the one chance we have to do this right." Jordan nodded slowly. "That's the dilemma. You either step into the fire or watch someone else burn it down for the wrong reasons." There was no easy answer. And perhaps that was the point. Real change didn't come with neat resolutions. It came through tension, through contradiction, through people sitting in discomfort long enough to learn something. But just as the city began to adjust to its new reality, a second leak hit the press. This one was different. Not from internal sources. From the state's attorney office. A closed investigation file, sealed years ago, accidentally surfaced in a digital archive search. It included audio of a conversation between Darren and another officer, discussing the suppression of evidence in a 2016 case involving the wrongful conviction of a teenager. That teen had spent 4 years in juvenile detention before being exonerated. The case had been settled quietly, and the officer involved had since been promoted. The news ignited a new wave of protest. This time, it wasn't about Darren. It was about the system that had allowed Darren to operate unchecked. And people wanted names. They wanted to know who had signed off. Who had stayed quiet. And why. Amara watched the coverage with a heavy heart. The boy from the case, Isaiah Daniels, was 23 now. He hadn't spoken to the media. He had moved to Atlanta, tried to start over. But the leak brought him back into the spotlight. A reporter reached out. He declined. A second followed. He refused again. Then one night, Amara got a call. It was Isaiah. "I don't know what to say to them," he said, his voice cautious, small. "But I want to talk to you." They met at a small diner off Broad Street, late at night, long after the dinner crowd had left. Isaiah was quiet, eyes scanning the room even though he was safe. He didn't touch his drink. Just stared at her with a kind of haunted wonder. "You stood up to him," he finally said. "I couldn't even stand up to a mirror after what they did to me." Amara shook her head gently. "You survived. That's not weakness, Isaiah. That's strength most people can't even imagine." He leaned back, exhaling hard. "They want me to speak. To testify. To be some kind of symbol. But I don't want to be their story. I want to be my own story." Her voice was warm but firm. "Then tell it your way. On your terms. No one gets to shape your truth but you." For the first time that night, he smiled. It was small. But it was real. In the weeks that followed, a new coalition formed, led by Isaiah, advised by Amara, supported by lawyers, teachers, artists, and even a few brave officers still in the force. It wasn't a movement built on anger. It was built on precision. Policy. Patience. But beneath all of that, it burned with a fire that refused to dim. Darren, for his part, disappeared from the public eye. He made one last statement through his lawyer, declining interviews, saying he would cooperate fully with the federal inquiry but would not seek to defend himself publicly any longer. He moved to a quiet county in Virginia, out of sight, but never truly out of mind. His legacy now lived in footnotes, in recorded transcripts, in testimonies that bore his name like a warning. But the story wasn't really about him anymore. It was about a city that had been cracked open. A woman who refused to be silent. A boy who chose to speak in his own voice. And a community finally ready to confront its reflection. What came next would not be easy. The city faced lawsuits. A full restructuring of its law enforcement leadership. Funding debates. Cultural shifts that brought discomfort into classrooms and courtrooms alike. But the ground had shifted. Permanently. And in that space, where old structures had crumbled, something new was beginning to rise. Not perfect. Not polished. But real. And it was only just beginning. The seasons began to shift quietly as Richmond moved into late fall, and with the change in the air came a strange stillness. The kind that settles after a storm but before the rebuilding begins in earnest. The leaves had turned deep amber and crimson, covering the sidewalks like fading confessions, and yet beneath that beauty there was still an ache in the bones of the city. The hearings continued, slowly unraveling more of what had been hidden for years. Testimonies poured in, most behind closed doors, some made public to keep the fire of transparency alive. And still, every night, Amara returned to the community center, not because it was an obligation, but because it remained the only place that felt real, where her purpose lived not in statements or headlines, but in eye contact, in open wounds being stitched with conversation. One of those nights, as she was locking up, she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, heavy. She turned to see Isaiah standing there, holding a folder. His expression was different now, less guarded, more resolved. He stepped into the light, handed her the folder without saying a word, and sat down on the bench outside. Amara opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the contents, transcripts, photos, signed affidavits. This wasn't just his story. It was others. Names she recognized. Faces she hadn't seen in years. She sat down beside him. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was sacred. After a few long moments, Isaiah spoke, his voice quiet but unwavering. He told her about the people he had reconnected with since the leak. About the mother of another boy who had been targeted the same year as him. About a woman who had been harassed but never came forward out of fear. About how all these years, they thought they were alone. And how, now, they weren't. He looked at Amara and said he wanted to start something permanent. Not just a foundation, not just a name on a flyer, but an actual institution. A place where survivors could come, not to relive their trauma, but to reclaim their future. A leadership academy, structured around healing, empowerment, and education. He wanted her help, not just to legitimize it, but because, in his words, "You were the first person who ever told me my silence wasn't my fault." Amara's throat tightened. She looked at him and said the only thing she could manage through the storm of emotion in her chest. "You're not just building something new. You're teaching this city how to remember the right way." Elsewhere, the consequences of the truth continued to unfold. One of the former commanders named in the investigation attempted to flee the state but was stopped at the airport. Another resigned days before the final federal report was due for release. The interim police chief, a younger black woman appointed after the scandal broke, made a public commitment to not just reform, but reconstruction. She reached out to Amara quietly, asking her to sit on the newly formed ethics board, not just as a figurehead, but as a decision-maker. When they met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe tucked between two bookshops, Amara came with no assumptions. The new chief, Lauren Sinclair, was soft-spoken but razor-sharp. Her first words were not about policy, but about pain. She had watched from the sidelines for years, trying to survive inside a system she now admitted had never been designed with people like her in mind. She had once believed that rising through the ranks would allow her to change it from within. But all it had brought her was isolation and silence. Now, for the first time, she said, she saw a window to truly tear it down and rebuild. And she couldn't do it alone. Amara leaned forward, eyes steady. "We won't get another shot at this. If we do this halfway, if we let the politics win, we won't just lose credibility, we'll lose lives." Lauren nodded slowly. "Then we go all in. Transparency. Oversight. Training. Civilian authority on use of force cases. And we start with culture. You in?" Amara didn't hesitate. "I've been in. You're just catching up." The following month was filled with meetings that didn't make headlines. Quiet rooms with loud truths. Survivors sitting with attorneys. Officers sitting across from civilians. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone healed. But something was moving forward, even if it stumbled. At a town hall, an elderly woman stood up and said, with tears in her eyes, "I lived through Jim Crow. I didn't think I'd see the day when justice would walk in wearing sneakers and a hoodie instead of a suit and tie." Amara smiled softly at that. Because that's what this was. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, unfinished, but real. And that's why it worked. One night, long after everyone had gone home, she found herself alone in the training studio again. She stood barefoot on the mat, eyes closed, moving through the same kata she had done the day of the incident in the park. But this time, it was different. Her movements weren't defensive. They were expressive. Reclaiming. With each motion, she wasn't just remembering pain, she was transforming it. At the end of the sequence, she stood in stillness, eyes closed, breath steady. And from the silence, she heard footsteps behind her. She opened her eyes to find Darren standing at the entrance, hands by his sides. He looked thinner, older. Tired. But not defeated. He didn't step onto the mat. He stayed at the edge, respecting the space. Amara didn't speak. She waited. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice rough. "They asked me to speak at the final hearing. Closure, they called it. I'm not sure that's what it is." Amara nodded once, slowly. He continued. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I've said a lot already. Some of it public, some of it in court. But this part, this is different. This isn't about saving myself anymore." Amara's voice was calm, clear. "Then speak to the ones you never looked at. Speak to the ones who lived in your reports as statistics. Speak to the silence you helped create. And don't ask for redemption. Just tell the truth and let the rest happen." He nodded, swallowing hard. "You know, when I first saw you that day, I didn't recognize what you were. I saw power, and it scared me. Because I never had it the right way. I had control, not respect. You had both, and I hated you for it. That wasn't about you. That was me. My cowardice." Amara took a breath, her gaze unflinching. "And now? I still don't have peace. But I'm closer to it than I've ever been. And that's because you didn't fight me with hate. You fought me with truth." She turned away, not in dismissal, but in closure. He understood. He left without another word. The final hearing was scheduled in 2 weeks. It would be public, streamed live, translated into multiple languages. The city would sit down together, leaders, officers, victims, organizers, and mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. Darren would speak. So would Isaiah. And so would Amara. But before that, there would be one final meeting. A gathering behind closed doors. Survivors only. No press. No cameras. Just chairs in a circle, a room full of people who had been broken and buried but had chosen to rise anyway. Amara would sit among them, not as a leader, but as one of them. And for the first time, they would tell each other the truths that had never made it to courtrooms or news channels. Because that was where healing started, not in policy, not in laws, but in the soft, defiant act of being seen. And when that night was over, and the last word had been spoken, Amara would step out into the cold night air, look up at the stars, and whisper to herself the one thing she never allowed herself to believe until now: "We're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, she actually meant it. The day of the final hearing arrived wrapped in a sky that couldn't make up its mind, clouds moving thick across patches of hesitant sun, wind curling against the skin like whispers of something unfinished. The courthouse plaza was filled before the doors even opened. Not with protesters this time, not with chants or demands, but with families holding hands, elders in lawn chairs, youth leaders organizing translation headsets, survivors gathered in small circles with eyes alert and tired. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. This was ritual. A collective reckoning. A moment the city had spent years unknowingly walking toward. Inside, the chamber had been rearranged, less formal, less rigid. The council had agreed to a semicircle seating design, a gesture meant to signal change, to break the old configuration of authority looking down from a raised dais. In the center sat a single podium, flanked by 2 chairs on either side where those giving testimony would sit together before and after speaking. No raised platforms. No barriers. Just people, facing each other. Amara arrived through a side entrance, not to avoid the crowd but to avoid the noise. Her footsteps echoed through the long hallway as she approached the chamber, her pulse steady but present. She wore navy blue, simple, sharp, unadorned. At her side was Jordan, who carried only a folder, the same one that had grown thicker with every document, every signature, every promise since that first day in the park. Neither of them spoke as they took their places in the front row, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The chairperson opened the hearing with a brief statement, acknowledging the pain that had brought them all there and the bravery that had allowed it to be seen. No applause followed. It wasn't that kind of day. Then, without fanfare, they called the first speaker. Darren walked to the podium with quiet steps. No camera flashes. No angry shouts. Just the sound of a city holding its breath. He looked thinner, wearier, but something about his posture had changed. Not performative. Not fragile. Just honest. He opened a folded page and stared at it for a few seconds before he began to speak. He didn't begin with an apology. He began with a memory. A traffic stop. A boy in the back seat. A lie he told in his report that led to an arrest that never should have happened. Then another. And another. Each one layered like sediment over the last, until his voice began to break. He spoke of fear, not fear of danger, but fear of accountability. How he had been taught that control was the only armor. That to question your own actions meant weakness. That weakness could cost you everything. He spoke of silence. Of covering for colleagues. Of the hierarchy that whispered threats through promotions and transferred discomfort through duty rosters. He looked up, and for a moment, his eyes locked with Amara's. He said her name, not like someone reciting blame or credit, but like someone naming a mirror they had been avoiding their whole life. He said she had given him a choice the day in the park. Not with her hands. With her restraint. Her dignity. Her refusal to become the violence he had been trained to expect. And then he said the words no one expected. I am not asking to be forgiven. I am asking to be forgotten. Because this is not about me. It never should have been. If you remember me, remember what happens when power goes unchecked. When we stop listening. When we let fear turn into policy. He folded his paper. Stepped away. Sat down in silence. Next, Isaiah was called to the podium. His suit didn't quite fit, borrowed, clearly, but he stood taller than he ever had. He began without notes. He didn't speak with rhetoric or passion. He spoke like someone remembering aloud in a room full of people who had been there but said nothing. He told the story of his arrest. Of the nights in detention when he didn't speak. Of the moment he stopped trusting his own instincts. He spoke of shame. How it followed him like smoke. How it poisoned his relationships, his sense of time, his belief in future. But then he shifted. He spoke of survival. Of watching the hearing weeks ago and hearing his name spoken by someone who had never met him but had fought for his dignity anyway. He turned to Amara and simply said, "Thank you for not needing to know me to protect me." He finished by announcing the launch of the academy, inviting the city to be part of something that didn't begin with pain but with possibility. And for the first time in that chamber, there was a moment of breath, a sense that maybe, just maybe, something whole could come from something broken. Finally, Amara stood. The room didn't shift. It centered. She didn't walk to the podium like a warrior. She walked like someone who had learned to carry fire without letting it consume her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pause for effect. She spoke like water, steady, unstoppable. She didn't talk about the park. Not directly. She talked about erosion. How institutions don't collapse in a day. They rot slowly, invisibly. And how people become part of that rot when they stop asking questions. When they stop feeling. She spoke of Malik. Of the mothers who had stood behind her when no one else did. Of the children in her classes who now walked taller, laughed louder, because they believed something new was possible. She didn't demand reform. She described it. Not as theory. As practice. As daily work. As cultural surgery. And then she asked a question. Not to the council. To the room. To rebuild a house, you have to gut it first. Are you ready to live in the mess long enough to make something better? Or are you just hoping the smell fades? Silence. Then nods. Then tears. When she stepped down, there was no standing ovation. Just quiet. Deep. Reverent. The kind of quiet that precedes real change. After the hearing, Amara walked out into the cold afternoon. Darren was already gone. Isaiah stood at the steps, flanked by a group of young volunteers holding binders and clipboards. He caught her eye and smiled. She walked to him, and for the first time since they met, she laughed, a full, rich laugh that cracked the heaviness of the day. "You ready?" he asked. She looked up at the sky, now just beginning to break open with light. "Not even close," she said. "But we start anyway." In the weeks that followed, the city began the work, not of erasing the past, but of engraving something new into its bones. Officers were retrained, but more importantly, they were rewired. Policies were rewritten in rooms filled with the very people those policies had once excluded. Survivors sat on advisory boards. Teenagers helped design training simulations. And Amara, though often asked to run, to lead, to become something official, chose instead to remain grounded, at the community center, on the mat, in the classroom, where the future was being built muscle by muscle, word by word. And in the quiet moments, when the crowd faded and the doors closed, she would sometimes sit alone, eyes closed, breathing slow, and whisper to herself not what had been lost, but what had been found in the fire. Winter arrived with a strange gentleness that year, the kind that made you pause between breaths as if the city itself was learning how to breathe again. Snow didn't fall heavy, but light, scattered across rooftops and sidewalks like a soft reset, not to erase, but to mark transition. Richmond had changed, not in headlines anymore, but in heartbeat. The streets moved differently. The people moved differently. You could hear it in the conversations, see it in the way officers walked through neighborhoods, not watched from behind curtains, but approached by children curious, not afraid. A system had been shaken at its foundation, and though the ground was still uneven, something new had begun to grow. Amara stood at the edge of a new chapter, but she hadn't rushed into anything. She had been offered positions, nominations, national stages. A university even proposed naming a program after her. But she had said no, gently, every time. Her power never needed to be official. She had built her legacy not from titles but from truth. And so she stayed at the community center, exactly where she started. Only now, it wasn't just a gym. It had expanded. The walls had been renovated, new classrooms built, therapy rooms added. What once held 24 students now welcomed hundreds every week. Survivors, students, officers in training, kids from schools across the district. The Leadership Through Defense program, led by Isaiah and guided by Amara, had received a city grant and now operated across 4 districts, teaching not only martial arts, but civic education, emotional resilience, and racial literacy. Amara had also taken on a mentorship program for young black women interested in public leadership. Not politics. Leadership. There was a difference. She taught them how to use their voice without apology, how to rest without guilt, and how to define power by how many people they could lift, not control. They called her Coach A mix of reverence and rebellion, and she liked that. She liked that they didn't need to fear her to respect her. That they came to her with questions, not caution. Darren, after testifying for the last time, had accepted a voluntary sentence as part of a restorative justice agreement. Instead of prison, he would spend 3 years working in reform programs under federal oversight. His role was not advisory. It was educational. He gave talks about misconduct and manipulation. He met with young recruits, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone forced to face the damage his choices caused. His life was quieter now. He moved to a small town an hour away, rarely visited Richmond, and never sought the spotlight again. But occasionally, Amara would receive a letter, handwritten, never signed, offering insights from his experience, updates on policy drafts he had helped revise, or sometimes just reflections. She never wrote back. But she always read them. Every word. Isaiah, now 24, had become one of the most respected young voices in the state. His organization, the Daniels Initiative, had partnered with several school districts and correctional facilities, creating programs that redirected at-risk youth before they ever entered the system. He had spoken in front of Congress, not as a politician, but as a witness, and his message was always the same: don't fix the system for us. Build a new one with us. He still visited the center weekly, still practiced on the mat with Amara, still carried the weight of what had been taken from him. But now, that weight was shared. Lauren Sinclair remained as police chief. She had instituted the most aggressive and transparent reforms the city had ever seen. Her leadership wasn't always popular, especially among the old guard, but it was undeniable. Under her command, community trust levels rose, not because of press releases, but because she let civilians lead the hardest conversations. She and Amara had become partners, in the truest sense of the word. They met every other Thursday, no press, no minutes recorded, just two women reimagining public safety over coffee, scars, and mutual resolve. As for the city, it still had wounds. Not everything was healed. Some voices still resisted. Some damage couldn't be undone. But the people had found their voice again. They had watched someone stand up, not with force, but with rooted truth, and they had followed. The murals still stood, but now they were joined by new ones, painted by children and teens, filled with images of possibility. There was still anger, yes, but it had direction now. It had purpose. One cold evening, Amara stood outside the center, hands in her coat pockets, watching her students spill out after a long session. Laughter echoed in the air, light against the frost. One of the girls, no more than 13, ran up to her, holding a journal, and said, "I wrote a poem about you today." Amara smiled and asked what it was called. The girl beamed and said, "It's called She Didn't Yell But Everyone Heard Her." And Amara, for the first time in weeks, felt her throat tighten, not from grief, but from pride. Because that was it. That was everything. The legacy. The reason. The echo that would carry far beyond her lifetime. Now, to you, yes, you listening. What did you feel during this story? Did your chest tighten when Amara stood her ground? Did you flinch when truth was buried and rise when it broke through? Did you feel yourself in Isaiah's silence, in Darren's collapse, in the tremble of a system forced to look at itself? What would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have listened? This isn't just a story. It's a mirror. And maybe, just maybe, it's a seed. For your voice. Your truth. Your moment to stand, calmly, but unshakably. If this story moved you, if it made you question, reflect, or see something you hadn't seen before, then don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Reflect on it. And most of all, keep watching. Subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful, human stories that don't just entertain, they transform. Because sometimes, the most unforgettable stories are the ones that sound like they could happen to someone you know. Or maybe, someone like you.